Hey class, welcome back. We are talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition today, which was an expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase that Thomas Jefferson had made in 1803. He got his private secretary and another man, Lewis and Clark, both to go explore. And, that one was in charge of everything. One of them was in charge of like the army and getting everybody together. So, and their job was to go and map out all this territory that had been purchased from the Louisiana Purchase. So and make their way all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and they had help along the way, but they did make their way. So they were asked by President Thomas Jefferson to explore and map the Wild West of North America. They traveled across the ocean to the Pacific Ocean and back again.
To the Pacific Ocean and back, Lewis and Clark were asked by President Thomas Jefferson to explore and map the Wild West of North America. They traveled across the country to the Pacific Ocean and back again.
All right, who were Lewis and Clark? You had Captain Meriwether Lewis. This is Captain Meriwether Lewis. He was President Thomas Jefferson's private secretary. He was in charge of the expedition to explore the newly purchased territory, and so he asked his friend William Clark to help.
Who were Lewis and Clark? Captain Meriwether Lewis, 1774 through 1809, was President Thomas Jefferson's private secretary. He was in charge of the expedition to explore the newly purchased Louisiana territory. He asked his friend William Clark to help.
All right. And then we had Lieutenant William Clark. This is Lieutenant William Clark here. He served in the United States Army, and he was responsible for hiring and training the men while Lewis gathered the equipment and supplies they would need.
Who were they? Continued. Lieutenant William Clark, 1770 through 1838, served in the United States Army. In preparing for the expedition, Clark was responsible for hiring and training the men, while Lewis gathered the equipment and supplies they would need.
All right. So Lewis and Clark, together with their team of over 40 men, they began their expedition at the St. Louis, in the city of St. Louis, all right? And they got all the way to the Pacific Ocean eventually. They packed lots of equipment down their trip, including rifles. They had food. They had warm clothing. They brought lots of glass beads and trinkets so they could trade with Native Americans along the way.
Setting off to explore, Lewis and Clark, together with their team of over 40 men, began their expedition at the city of St. Louis on May 14, 1804. They packed lots of equipment for the trip, including rifles, food, and warm clothing. They even brought lots of glass beads and trinkets so they could trade with the Native Americans along the way.
All right. So they started out traveling up the Missouri River, and they had one large boat called a barge and two smaller boats called pirogues. They were traveling against the current, so they had to use long poles to push the boats or even pull the boats from the bank. So that's what happens if you're going against the current. It makes the trip a whole lot harder.
Setting off to explore continued. They started out traveling up the Missouri River. They had one large boat called a barge and two smaller boats called pirogues. They were traveling against the current, so they had to use long poles to push the boats or even ropes to pull the boats from the banks.
All right. So then they met Native Americans along the way. They met a lady, Sacagawea, and Sacagawea became a big help on this expedition to them. All right. They spent the first winter with the Mandan Nation, and there they met a fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau and his Shoshone wife, Sacagawea.
Sacagawea and the Native Americans. Lewis and Clark met many Native American tribes along the way. Although there were some tense moments, they made friends and traded with many different tribes. They even spent the first winter with the Mandan Nation. There they met a fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau and his Shoshone wife, Sacagawea.
So Sacagawea joined the expedition, and she was an interpreter for them because she could speak English and she could speak the native tongues. So she helped the expedition in a lot of ways. All right, she showed them edible plants. She showed them how to keep peace and trade with different tribes. And without the help of Sacagawea, this expedition probably would have failed.
Sacagawea continued. Sacagawea joined the expedition as an interpreter. She helped the expedition in many ways as they traveled, including showing them edible plants and helping to keep peace and trade with different tribes. Without help from Sacagawea, the expedition would have failed.
All right, the Great Falls and the Rockies. This was a big, big place. They had a hard time getting across the Great Falls and the Rockies. All right, the Missouri River. It continued up the Missouri River into today was the state of Montana. They ran into the Great Falls. All right, so it took them nearly a month to carry their boats for miles. They had to go around the Great Falls in order to get back on track, and it took them several months to do this.
Great Falls and the Rockies.
Or nearly a
The
month.
expedition continued up the Missouri River into what is today the state of Montana. They ran into the Great Falls. It took the men nearly a month to carry their boats for miles around the Great Falls.
All right. So next, Lewis and Clark, they came to the Rocky Mountains, and they were much more difficult to traverse than what they expected. And when they finally made it across the Rockies, they met the Nez Perce people who helped them with food and shelter.
Rockies. Next, Lewis and Clark came to the Rocky Mountains. These mountains were much more difficult to traverse than they first expected. When they finally made it across the Rockies, they met the Nez Perce people who helped them with food and shelter.
And finally, November 1805, around a year and a half after leaving St. Louis, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean. And they stayed that winter near the ocean and started back home again in March. And it only took them to get back about 6 months for the return journey, but they were logging stuff and doing stuff, mapping stuff out on their journey to the Pacific Ocean. On the way back, they were just trying to get back, I guess, and it only took them 6 months compared to about a year and a half.
Pacific Ocean. It was in November of 1805, around a year and a half after leaving St. Louis, that they finally reached the Pacific Ocean. They stayed that winter near the ocean and started home again in March of 1806. It only took them around 6 months for the return journey.
All right, comprehension questions. What are Lewis and Clark most known for? A, running, B, exploring, or C, stealing? They are best known for exploring, or the Louisiana Purchase expedition, all right, where they went and mapped out the Louisiana Purchase all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 2, what U.S. president hired Lewis and Clark to explore the land west of the United States? Was it A, Thomas Jefferson, B, Barack Obama, or C, Abraham Lincoln? It was A, Thomas Jefferson who did this.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 3, what river did Lewis and Clark expedition follow during the first part of their trip? Was it A, the Chicago River, B, the Catawba River, or C, the Missouri River? It was C, the Missouri River. They started in St. Louis, Missouri.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, what Native American helped Lewis and Clark on their expedition? What was her name? Was it A, Sacagawea, B, Metacomet, or C, Pocahontas? It was A, Sacagawea was her name. She was married to the fur trapper Toussaint Charbonneau, and she went along on the expedition, served as an interpreter, helped them with many different things, and without her, they probably would not have made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And that is all. Be sure you go on to Schoology. Go through this. Turn it in. Get credit. And I will see you all next time. You all have a very good day.